All right, so we are on to part two of our notes on the Mayan civilization, and today we're going to primarily be looking at their culture and their way of life. So, just like many of the civilizations that we have studied and will continue to study this year, they did have their own social pyramid. That's that way of determining who had the most power, typically the most wealth, all the way down to who was considered kind of the low man in the pyramid, the person that typically did not have as much power. So it's a pyramid showing power, but it also shows the numbers, the population. So the top of the pyramid is smaller, therefore there's fewer people. So in the Mayan pyramid, it was almost impossible to move up. Once you were placed somewhere within a pyramid, you kind of stayed there. But it was based on the talents of the children. So if your child, if you were a farmer and your child was an exceptionally gifted craftsman, they could work their way up and therefore bring you up. But that was pretty much the only way to do that. And you really had to prove yourself. So it was not easy to do. The nobles did not appear in public at all without one of their slaves holding a cloth in front of their face. So they kind of tried to hide their identity. It was almost like they were too good to look upon anyone who wasn't a noble. In fact, once they were out in public, no common person was even allowed to talk to a noble. If you wanted to, you had to speak to their attendant or their servant, and then their servant would then speak to them. So it was pretty rigid, and they followed it fairly closely. So one of the groups there are their warriors. Mayans were often at war, and their warriors trained for most of their lives. They were skilled warriors. They did have weapons, typically made out of stone, wood, and shells, but they did not use any metals for their weapons. That's often a common misconception about them when you see them in movies. So they would have these weapons that they used. They'd carry shields, and they were very well respected among the Mayan civilization and the Mayan people. These were fierce warriors, fierce soldiers that were there to protect and to help expand and make the empire known. Women, like I said in our previous notes, actually were valued more so than other ancient civilizations. The women were allowed to participate in government, in politics, and economics, and farming. They could do many of the same things that the men could do. In fact, when we talk about these warriors that are going off to battle and soldiers, women help prepare these men for battle and sometimes help train with them, help get their armor ready, get everything what it needed to be. The only thing was women were not allowed to go fight in the battle. So they could do everything up until that point. Women also would take care of any religious shrines at the home and help to make sure that the gods were honored properly. They would care for the home, the meals, the kids, and they would make the clothing. So women kind of had the weight of the world on their shoulders in this civilization, but they were clearly very well respected as well. As far as inheritance, we've talked in some ancient civilizations what women can own and what they can't in different ancient civilizations. In this case, women could not inherit homes or land from their parents. So while they could serve in government, they were unable to inherit any kind of home or land. So if families had only daughters, because typically you would pass down your land or your homes to your sons, if you had a family of only daughters, they would leave home as soon as they were married and go live with their husband's family until they had kids. And so that's how they could gain possession of things through their husbands. The problem was if you went to live with your husband's family, the in-laws had no rules about how they had to treat you. And so often they could be treated quite horribly. And these girls were just kind of left in that situation because it was the only option they really had. Once a woman had a child for her husband, once she had kids, the village would then give that couple land that they could live on and garden. As far as children, children were often treated like adults. They were just mini adults. They had a lot of responsibility. They were expected to grow up quickly and understand what needed to be done for survival and for well being of their families. And so they learned this from their parents. If your dad's a farmer, you're going to work with him, alongside him. You're going to learn everything you can so that you can do it as well. And likewise, girls did the same thing, and they would be expected to learn how to weave and sew and cook and everything else that went into that. For schools, most commoners' kids did not go to school. That was a thing more for wealthy, and the wealthy nobles' kids were typically taught at home, or their school would be like small groups of kids with one teacher that they privately paid. So school wasn't necessarily a necessity, because, as I said, you could learn from your parents or from the tutor. They didn't have a lot of toys, again, trying to learn and grow up quickly. So, what toys they did have were replicas of work tools, which really we still kind of do that today. Even when you go down, the Walmart toy aisle and you see like toy vacuums or the toy lawn mowers and that kind of thing. They're replicas of tools and things that you might use when you're older. But for these kids, it was learning to play with them because that's what you're going to have to do very quickly. Children, while treated like adults, they were not officially considered an adult until they turned 15, at which point the village would have a coming of age ceremony and they could get married. So at age 15, you officially became adult. You were expected to go through this ceremony, get married, and start really living on your own, pulling your own weight, and working. As far as laws and the court system, all people had the same laws. It did not matter if you were a noble or a servant. You had to follow the same laws. And if a law was broken, the judges would hear the cases and evidence in a court type setting, and your punishment had to fit the crime. So, like, you could be held captive if you stole something. So they would take you if you took something else. Um, it could also be a humiliating crime. Like they could shave off all your hair, which, especially for warriors and things, strength was seen as something through your hair. It was a point of pride and honor. So to have your head shaved would be absolutely humiliating for many of these people. So the punishment would fit whatever the crime was, and sometimes completely so. So, like murder was very rare in the Mayan culture because if you were found guilty of murder, your punishment was to be put to death in the same way that you killed somebody. So, if you strangled somebody, you would be strangled to death. If you stabbed somebody, you would be stabbed to death. So, whatever it was that you did to somebody else, that's what was going to come to you. So most people would not commit murder because of the horrors of what would happen to them if they were caught. Their homes were typically several buildings kind of built around patios and courtyards. Didn't matter your wealth. Wealthier obviously had bigger homes and maybe nicer courtyards, but the same basic style, kind of like in this picture here. And so then different generations of families would all live together. So it might be grandma lives here, aunts and uncles live here, you live here, your siblings live here, whatever it might be. But you all share this area outside. So families were very close knit. They tried to stay together while still respecting their own space. And these homes could even be like a maze, and you could have bedrooms and all sorts of rooms throughout these areas that you had to know how to get to. They did typically share a common living area, but a separate kitchen. So, like an area where they hang out, they might all share, but they might all have their own kitchen or even have a separate building that's a kitchen for everyone. They did have some furniture, not a whole lot, and it would be made from stone or wood, kind of the resources that they had available to them. As far as fashion, nobles really cared about grooming and fashion. That was something of great importance to them. Hair would be kept long and then braided or wrapped up. It was colorful, embroidered clothing made from cotton and hemp, so typically softer, and they would be woven It says weaved in beautiful designs, but woven into these beautiful designs, kind of like in this picture, this girl's top that she's wearing. It'd be very loose and draping. Part of that just to stay cool because it does get very hot there. And they would wear like blouses or skirts for women and kind of like cloth skirts for men. And as you can see, because this obviously is a modern picture, some of these people that live up in the mountains and the civilizations there that I said hold on to their Mayan culture still very much dress this way. Um, they often would also wear turbans and hats on their head in an effort to stay cool. During the day, it gets exceptionally hot there. At night, it might get colder. And these blankets um, actually provide a way to stay cool with their breathability, but they're also very thick and they will keep you warm as well. As far as food, they had plenty to eat. They loved to eat and they ate plenty. So women would prepare all of the meals. For proteins and meat, when it was available, they would hunt for turkey, deer, ducks, and even monkey were prevalent at the time. That is not something that's typical now. Now, a lot of times you've got like chicken and that kind of stuff. They would eat fish and bird eggs. Vegetables, they had sweet potatoes, corn, maize, beans, peppers, squash. But maize was, which is a type of corn, is pretty much the most important because not only could you use it as a vegetable, but you could grind it up to make tortillas and breads, as seen in this picture, making homemade tortillas. For entertainment, just like with the Aztecs, they like to play ball games similar to basketball. And it was kind of like this. They would play this to honor the gods at the temple, and they did it every 20 days. There would be one of these big tournaments and games. And I kind of explained it before, but think of a mix between soccer, basketball, and kickball. So you have this huge court at the temple. This is the playing field or the court that they would play on. And you can kind of see here there's rings up in the top of the wall, pretty high up, typically between 8 and 10 feet up. And they could be smaller. And you had a ball. Each team had an assigned ring. You were not allowed to touch the ball with your hands, but you had to try and get it through the hoop. You could kick it, you could hit it with your head, your hip, whatever you needed to. And this could get very rough. Men would get very competitive. There weren't a whole lot of rules, so people would get hurt. There would be broken bones and bruises by the end because you wanted to be on the winning team. And they especially didn't care if it was one of the games that they were playing against captives, because sometimes a prisoner of war would be forced to play in this game as well on the opposing team. So that is all your notes about the Mayan culture.